vineyards and then being able to compare notes, that's something that's really helped push the level of quality really high and really bring the evolution of Santa Barbara really far really quickly.
Sorry, can
Hey,
you,
Charles, hey, Jeff.
where do I'm trying to figure out how I allow you to screen share.
That is slightly above my pay grade, but I think it is in Zoom settings. It's been a zillion years since I played with that.
And I'm sorry.
I can grab my wife. She actually just did this on her Zoom when I practiced a few minutes ago.
No, I just saw it the other day. I just can't figure out which one of these options. They've changed the options.
Isn't that the usual tech thing where you get this update and then everything moves around and you're like, where the hell is that? You know?
Hey, Brandon, Jessica, who's on the line right now, I think she's been to the winery to visit you guys.
Yep, which is awesome.
Yep.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too, John. Good to see you as well.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Great. Sun's finally out after our, little rainstorm, which is we should be embarrassed to even complain about it, but it did rain for a bunch, which we needed. It's good.
The flooding you could have done without, I suppose, though.
That wasn't.
That was further south, or how'd you all fare with that?
Yeah, we were.
Yeah.
Yeah, these bursts, I mean, Santa Barbara is a land of extremes. I mean, it's interesting because when you think about it, especially coming from the East Coast, it seems like it's beaches and palm trees and just something that's kind of temperate and calm all the time. And I mean, again, we can't complain about the weather and we won't, but what often happens with our weather is it goes from one extreme to the other. And so in wintertime, I mean, there was a number of years where we'd have a week of 80 degrees in January. Fortunately, we didn't have that this year nor last year, but we have had these things that when the rain comes, they're now calling it the atmospheric rivers,
right,
where you can get half your average rainfall in a day. And depending on where you are, my house is one place that, the yard fills up fast. And so there's some sandbagging involved.
I think I've allowed multiple people to share screens now, so see if you can do it.
Cool, let me give it a shot. Yeah, it looks like it.
Oh, good.
Are you guys seeing a vineyard map?
Yep.
Yes.
Great.
Awesome. Yeah, well, so speaking of Santa Barbara, I'd love to kind of quickly start with this just because it's, I think, such a good way to kind of contextualize where we are and what we're doing. See if that, is the whole thing visible to you guys now? You can see the coast and everything? Yeah, so this puts in perspective, the town of Santa Barbara is off the map. It would be down, a little bit, another hand or so off screen. But everything that we work with in terms of vineyards is included within essentially the San Ynez AVA. We have one little vineyard, Duvarita, that sits just outside of it. But the larger San Ynez AVA, which encompasses all the sub-AVAs like Santa Rita Hills and Ballard Canyon and Happy Canyon, spans about 30 miles from end to end. And you'll notice that you have the San Ynez Range down in the south and then the San Rafael Mountains on the north running essentially east to west. And so what it does, you see this huge flat plain near the town of Lompoc. It allows the prevailing winds to come straight off the ocean and cruise inland totally unimpeded. And so though we're technically in quote unquote Southern California, we always say that once you kind of round the tip of Point Conception down here, you're basically moving into a totally new zone. And so though we're in Southern California, you have the Santa Rita Hills being one of the coolest weather wine growing regions anywhere in the United States. It's a UC Davis Region 1 at the far west end, which is similar to Champaign. But then we have this crazy differential, whereas you travel from end to end, if you go out from Radian and you drive out to Happy Canyon on a classic August day, you gain about 1 degree per mile. So on the same day where Radian might have a high temp of 77, Happy Canyon might be pushing into the hundreds. And then Happy Canyon sits tucked up into the mountains. So though it has the warmest days, it has the coldest nights. And so the hugest diurnal swing. And so we have that combination of kind of wind and fog and then also brilliant sunshine throughout the growing season that results in some pretty unique potential. And we're really excited. One of the things that kind of we've seen as our mission is to produce wines that represent Santa Barbara County, as best we can. And so though we don't own any land, we work with what we feel are some of the best vineyards for each of the different varieties that we work with. And so we work with, and you guys are selling Sauvignon Blanc from Happy Canyon, Chardonnay from in and around Santa Rita Hills, Pinot Noir from Santa Rita Hills, and then our Syrah we source primarily from Ballard Canyon, and then also from a couple of vineyards at the very eastern edge of the Santa Rita Hills. And those things, that 10-mile differential between John Sebastiano and Stoltman, for instance, provides pretty dramatic differential in terms of the style of Syrah. And we end up blending to kind of take advantage of the way that those things, work in complementary fashion. But it's, for us, it's pretty great. We work with a total of about 40 acres spread across just over 15 different vineyards and a lot of really, really small parcels. And it just gives us an incredible ability to both access, kind of the right grape in the right place, and then also to be really nimble at harvest, which we have found to be very, very fortunate given the sort of challenges, so to speak, that happen on certain harvests. If you have a heat wave, we're able to be in different vineyards at the same time. And let me see if I can do a quick little.
Brandon, and say,
jump in, John. Yeah.
We actually are in the vineyards at harvest time, which is pretty rare, especially for people of our advancing age. And Brandon just had a big break. I'm sure we're the only 50-year-old people riding tractors during harvest, but we are involved, at harvest, and each one of us, one of the three of us, will be at each one of the picks. So we can do three to maybe even 6 different picks in one day if we need be, because all of our little sections are pretty small. But also gives us great diversity of sources too. So even if we have, Brandon mentioned 15 vineyards, but if you counted, see, there's 6 blocks at Radian, 4 to 5 blocks at Fiddlesticks, a couple blocks at Rita's Crown, so multiple blocks, and everything adds to the complexity of the final wine. So I just want to point that out when it comes to dealing with the inclement harvest time abilities. We are very flexible, and that's a benefit of being small.
Yeah, and that's when, if you guys are seeing the picture of the three of us, that's myself, Steve Dragonette in the middle, and then John there out at Grassini Vineyard, which you guys are pulling in the last of, I think, 4 cases of the 21 Grassini, which is exciting, which are those grapes right there. And so that just kind of gives a little bit of an example. John talks about us being out in the vineyards. So we have a preference to lease as by the acre as we can so that we know our sections year round. And we can implement things like specific pruning methods during the winter, even select the pruning dates at certain vineyards, control yield throughout the season, manage canopy, shoot positioning, shoot thinning, cluster thinning. And then at harvest time, we're out there with the crews doing sorting. So you can see by this bin of grapes that, the level of quality that we reach before the grapes hit the winery is way up there. And then we have the ability to do another sort at the winery if we'd like to. But our goal is to create the best raw materials in the vineyard so that, we're starting with the best potential that we can. We take a pretty simple approach in the cellar, and we'll kind of talk about that when we talk about some of the individual wines as we go on. But we definitely see it as a big part of our job is to be there throughout, not only select these amazing vineyard sites, but then be there through the season to maximize the quality potential. So those are some fun. You kind of see that tone of green. You'll see when you get the Grassini actually has a green label that represents both, the kind of specific fruit tones in the fruit, and then also the green from the serpentinite that's in the soil out there. This is a metamorphic rock that's really important in Grassini Vineyard and Vogelsang Vineyard and a number of Happy Canyon vineyards. It limits the vigor on the vine. So Sauvignon Blanc is naturally a big producer, really productive. But this and then some of our pruning and farming techniques limit the yield. So we're targeting more like 3.5 tons an acre, where if you look at your average New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc producer, they're probably aiming for more like 8 or 9 tons to the acre. So kind of a different stylistic differential just to start with. And I wanted to whip over and show you some pictures. So, Grassini, we have tightly spaced, vertically shoot position vines right there behind us. Grimm's is really unique. Both of these, by the way, are family-run operations. So there's the Grassini family, and then there's Rick and Aurora Grimm that they kind of cut their teeth on wine. Rick lived in Monaco for 20 years and saw these vines in the south of France that were head trained and wide spaced to take advantage of the kind of the Mediterranean climate. And so when he planted out in Happy Canyon, he thought he would try that to see if we could be a little bit more judicious with water management. And it's resulted in something that's pretty interesting. So this is some of the only head trained Sauvignon Blanc in California outside of a couple old blocks at the Tokelon Vineyard. And you see this kind of a bonsai style of farming. These stakes are about 3 or 4 feet. The vines are just teeny tiny, way down near the ground. The clusters are just these little teeny grenade-like things that fit in the palm of your hand and have just tremendous amounts of kind of soil character and flavor to them. This is another view from another portion of Grimm's where we have some head trains. So we have about 2/3 of our fruits from the head train, and then about 1/3 comes from these vertically shoot position vines. And we're standing on the rock pile that is essentially the subsoil. All of those vines have kind of 3 to 8 feet of clay, and then just a huge, huge pile of an ancient riverbed below them. So you'll see when you get the Grimm's, the Grimm's has kind of a beigeish gray color to it. And these rocks right here, were the inspiration for that. We wanted to kind of let that terroir shine through. And of the different Sauvignon Blancs, you'll see, Grissini tends to be really vividly tropical, kind of classically Happy Canyon, a little more green fruited spectrum, where the Grimm's tends to be much more like liquid mineral. Really fascinating that they're literally next door neighbors, but they have pretty widely divergent styles, which is why we bottle them as different single vineyards. And I know, John, if you want to kind of quickly touch on winemaking or just a little tidbit about what makes the Sauves a little different.
Sure. So, when it comes to Sauvignon Blanc program, we're first of all, we consider it, one of the great grapes of the world. Obviously, when we worked at our little wine shop where we first met, we were tasting the Domaine de Chevaliers, and we did even spring for a bottle of Aubryon once, which was painful, but it was worth doing. But going for a very serious style of Sauvignon Blanc, longer aging in wood, even a little bit of new oak. And so, we've got lower yields in the vineyards. We bring it into the cellar. We whole cluster press to tank, cold settle overnight, and go straight to barrels. So these are all barrel fermented. About maybe 20 to 25% stainless, perhaps, depending on, we do some in stainless and some in wood. I think the Grissini is all wood in this vintage, but I can't remember.
Yep.
Off the top of I write them all, but I can't remember them because we've written so many of them, and this is an old vintage. Anyway, so barrel fermented, barrel aged, 16 months on the lees the entire time. And Brandon was suggesting I go to the winery, but we have these great cigar-shaped barrels that we got that sort of inspired by Didier Dagenot from the Persang wines. They have a long, skinny barrels that have lots of lees contact. So it is a very serious style of making Sauvignon.
Just for a quick question, is this for both Grimm's and Grissini or just one of the two?
Both of them. Although, typically we like to put Grissini in barriques, so we use one new barrique a year for that, which is, and then the cigar-shaped barrels we use for the Grimm's and also for Vogelsang, which is another one of our single vineyard wines.
But the Grissini does also see some large format, so it's not necessarily cigars, but we have almost every barrel size and shape for Sauvignon Blanc. So we do some 300-liter casks, some 320s that are really thick staved. So Grissini will get a mix, like John was saying, when we use new oak on the Grissini, it's usually a dummy barrel, like a 228 Burgundy barrel, where with the Grimm's, it would be new cigars typically. But the large format plays a role in all of the Sauvignon Blancs, just to kind of give that way the oak is a little more structural rather than powerfully aromatic, and allows the wine to kind of develop a little slower as well.
Guys, I just want to note that I am recording this. This is coming kind of fast and furious. So if you want to go back through, like if you're trying to do a write-up for a customer or, talk to a customer about the wine, if you want to go back and refresh your memory, we're going to post this on our YouTube channel so you can go back and pull it. And I'll put minute markers in for when we talk about the wines. You can easily go to that wine and hear it from the source instead of from a tech sheet, which is much better. Sorry for interrupting.
Awesome. And I know we're kind of trying to keep this on a little bit of a timeline. So we could go, I think that the big picture thing is that, you have these really great vineyards, and then the barrel regime is more about respecting the fruit because there's so much concentration and power in it that extended time in barrel allows the wine to really develop layer after layer. And with the Sauvignon Blancs, we're definitely going for something that, you know, respects each of the vineyards, but then also shows quite a lot of texture. They're wines that, you know, you'll see, you guys are about to receive the 2021 Grissini and then the 2022 Grims. They drink great out of the gates, which is nice since we're selling wine today. But they are wines that show positive evolution for over a decade. I think we're lucky in Santa Barbara that across the board, the wines tend to drink well when they're young, which is super important when we're selling them today. But they do have really beautiful aging curves for people who like to hang on to a few bottles as well. I wanted to touch a quick note just on our overall farming, just so you can tell your customers or your clients about this. Some of the vineyards that we work with have certifications. So for instance, Grimm is certified biodynamic. Duvarita Vineyard, which is in this picture with the cute little sheep, is also certified biodynamic. Vineyards like Radian and Bent Rock and Fiddlesticks are SIP certified, sustainable. So we work with a wide range of different things, but for us, the most important thing is to not use herbicides like Roundup. So this picture right here shows a right and a left. This is the exact same appellation, the exact same soil. Both of these are sandy soils, the exact same day of the growing season. And it sort of shows on the left, you can see what a conventional routine does over time. It gets to the point where it's basically like a desert. Whereas on the right, you know, this is a particular vineyard that's, you know, both biodynamic and regenerative. So, I mean, it really is aiming to build the soil. But across the boards for the vineyards that we work with, you know, we want to bring as much life and energy to the soil as we can so that that's, you know, the vines can actually interact with the soil. And I think that's one of the things that's been a cool evolution in Santa Barbara. You know, when we first started, there were very few organic properties. And it's been something that, again, has had a pretty quick evolution in terms of moving from a conventional regime to something that is at least more organic leaning. And again, we're not super dogmatic about it in the sense that the vineyards that we work with would range from SIP to organic to biodynamic. But what we do like about it is just the idea of trying to retain a life in the vineyard as opposed to kind of try to nuke it out of there. And that actually, if we transition into Chardonnay, I'll bring up another picture real quick here. This is kind of an interesting story. This is John and I at the top of our block at Rita's Crown. So this is one of the highest points of elevation in the Santa Rita Hills. This is the sort of a typical day in Santa Rita where you have that up higher level marine layer. So this was probably late morning or early afternoon. And, you know, the sun still hasn't poked its way all the way out there. And Rita's Crown would be another example of farming practices. So this is a vineyard that we were part of from the very beginning before it was even planted. We were able to do block selection. We were looking for diatomaceous earth, which I'll show you in just a second. But over the course of time since it's been planted, that vineyard has gone from, it was planted under kind of a conventional regime by kind of an investor group. And then it's several years ago, it was purchased by Sea Smoke, and they've certified it organic and used what they think and we think are the kind of good bits of biodynamics in order to, you know, bring about more character to the wine. And as that vineyard has, you know, kind of with each progressive year, the vines have grown really slowly because of the diatomaceous earth, but they really have a ton of character. And that's another bit. I know that Jess has seen this at the winery, but anybody who visits, we love to show it off. The diatomaceous earth is unique to Santa Rita Hills that we know of in terms of vines growing on it. And in the mid 2000s, we were fortunate enough to be part of the development process out at what became Radian and Bent Rock and Rita's Crown. And we had seen this in the subsoil of some of the vineyards, like the more iconic vineyards like Sanford and Benedict and Fiddlesticks, but there was nowhere where vines were planted right on top of it. And so that's one of the unique things about certain blocks at Rita's Crown and certain blocks of Radian is they're purely diatomaceous. And what drew us to it is that it's basically like almost looks like a sponge right here. It's ancient algae that's fossilized. And so it's really super water retentive. That's why it's used in sort of pool filters and kitty litters and all sorts of things like that. And so we thought in our typical growing season, we see almost no rain throughout the active growing season of the vine. So we'd like to look for soils that hold on to water to allow us to irrigate as little as possible. And in some cases, the DE is a little stingy. It doesn't like to give things back. So some of those vines are like, I mentioned bonsai earlier, but I mean, you look at a 13 or 14-year-old vine at Rita's Crown and Radian, and it looks kind of like a 7-year-old vine from, you know, hardier clay soils. But that the smaller vines keep the cluster sizes down and bring a lot of flavor to the wines. I was going to give you guys another quick view of what Rita's Crown looks like. Because it sits at a higher elevation, it's often above the fog line. And so this is that same block where John and I were standing in, and you can see the fog down there. Those hills on the very far distance are actually the tippy top of Radian Vineyard. So elevation plays kind of a key role here, where it allows good sun exposure throughout the season. And so Rita's Crown Chardonnay, you guys actually have a couple different vintages of that to play with, which is awesome because it's a wine that ages incredibly well. But it's really influenced by both the ruggedness of the DE, the steepness of the slopes. And again, the camera always flattens things. But I mean, if you're walking up this slope, you quickly start huffing and puffing and develop a sweat.
Yeah.
And I don't know, John, if you wanted to touch on any more Rita's Crown before we move into Pinot.
Just a fantastic site. One of the things about Rita's Crown is, there have been movements in winemaking about, low alcohol or natural, blah, all this kind of stuff. And one of the things about Rita's Crown is really interesting is I don't think we've ever made one under 14% alcohol. However, that is what the ripeness of this site is. It with the sun and the long season, and we don't really have any rain at harvest time if we did, it would be very small amounts. That we have an incredibly long growing season out there. So the wine will, the grapes are acquiring sugar slowly though. And so, we're picking this in the middle of October and it's saged 14.2. But because of the DE in the soil and the cool nights and just the cool overall long season, the acidity is fantastic. So from a chemistry perspective, I want to say it's 14.2 up, but 3.25 pH at harvest, goes all the way through full malolactic and ends up at 3.4, say it was something ballpark. That is what we sort of think of as what great sites can do, is they have this perfect amount of ripeness while still retaining acidity and tension and reflecting the soil's minerality. And I know that's a weird word these days, but there definitely is a mineral characteristic to that wine when you taste it. That's why, as Brandon was mentioning, these wines will age because they've got great balance with full ripeness, but fantastic structure and acidity. And that's why we use sort of light to medium toast new oak barrels. I think it's, somewhere between 25 and 40%, depending on the vintage for this. Grapes are so intense and there's so much flavor, they can just absorb all that great oak spice and flavor and structure. And it's a tremendous site actually. And what we would consider a Grand Cru site in Santa Barbara, just because of that ability to get perfect ripeness at perfect balance. So.
Yeah, and be somewhat self-limiting in terms of the yields and whatnot. I mean, one of our goals is that if we set up the pruning right and the shoot thinning right, hopefully that allows you to actually do less in terms of manipulations in the vineyard as time goes on. Where there's some folks who would routinely want to do a green harvest, we'd like to try to set the tempo early in the season so the vine can concentrate its energy on what's actually on the vine without having to remove stuff later. And of course, we can and do that if we need to, depending on if you have a really fruitful vintage. But in many cases, you'll end up with something where that soil, and here's another shot of it. This is actually from Radian Vineyard, but same sort of a thing, like where you have just this incredible deposits of it. It naturally limits the yield, so you have this really well balanced crop. And as John was saying, it just gives kind of phenomenal raw materials to start with. Moving quickly over to Pinot, and this actually kind of shows it. So this is a cluster of Pinot Noir at Radian. You can actually even see some of the diatomaceous dust on it. But to put it in perspective, one cluster at Radian weighs, a half to a third of what a cluster of Pinot Noir would weigh from like Fiddlesticks or Sanford and Benedict Vineyard, or even parts of Bent Rock. I mean, it's really amazing how that kind of DE effect will do that. And then of course in Santa Barbara, the other thing that happens is, like John talked about, that really long season. We'll often have bud break in March, but won't harvest till September or October. So you're looking at 5 or 6 months of active growth. And for the grapes, one of the things that does is, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are naturally quote unquote thin skinned, but all that exposure to the sun, the grapes, pop out more polyphenolic compounds, more tannins in the reds and more phenolics in the whites to protect them from the sun. And so you end up with, a lot of power in those skins. And so that's one reason that when you move to Pinot Noir in Santa Rita Hills, it's pretty frequent that the wines will actually have quite a bit of color, even if they're not over the top in terms of ripeness. And that just comes from, there's just so much that the grapes have to give right there. And we've learned over time to kind of extract gentler and gentler over time, because there's so much power in the grapes that you really don't need too much in order to bring that out in the finished wine. And so you have that kind of combination of, again, this is a kind of quick side note on Radian, but you have diatomaceous earth or chert soils, tons of rocks out there, and just a really dramatic site where you have almost every aspect of the compass represented. So this is kind of from the top. We work with block 66 right here, block 56 across the way, block 58 above that. We've worked with block 60 in the past, and it's terrific. One of the things that we really love about these vineyards where we can have multiple parcels within the same vineyard is that for a single vineyard wine, it brings a lot of completeness and complexity. So it's one thing to have one block and one little section of a vineyard and make a single vineyard wine. You're kind of just rolling the dice each year, where here we have so much diversity within the vineyard that we can do a selection within that. And so all of the fruit is farmed to a really, really high level. And then when we get into the winery, everything is done with, kind of kid glove care. It's, John and Steve and I and my brother-in-law, Brian, that are doing all the activities throughout the winery. And where am I going with that? Just that having such great raw materials just gives us a lot to work with in the winery. And it makes our job easier too. I mean, we prefer native yeasts. We take a pretty old school approach to what's happening in the cellar, where it's kind of a less is more approach. Pinot Noir, might get a little bit of pumping over, a little bit of punching down, depending, just literally it's smelling and tasting and seeing what it needs. And then when things go into barrel, John already talked about that a little bit with Sauvignon Blanc, but Chardonnay and Pinot Noir as well stay on their lees, from the time they come out of the fermenter until right before bottling. So I think it really helps bring kind of a textural finesse to the wines.
Right. I was going to add on that Radiant, the picture of the vineyard you guys saw there, which you have to see it in person. The picture does no justice. It's like if you go to the Grand Canyon and you take a picture of it and you say, why did I even bother? There's so much more the naked eye, but those different blocks all face in different directions. So we've got some that are east facing, west facing, north and south facing, and they will be picked as much as 2 weeks apart, even though, how much they're not that far apart, right? But there's that much difference in ripening if you're facing south versus north. The north, the sun is sort of behind you. South, you're looking straight at the sun. You're getting much more heat, the baking of the soil as well. But each one of those blocks and another thing you should do is come to the winery and taste with us, because if it's the right time of year, you can really taste how much different these blocks are that are in the same vineyard. And some of them it's clonal because there are different clones in these blocks, but it's just also the aspect. And maybe this site has more rocks and this site has more clay, and they come out they're completely different wines. But when we blend them together, you get additional complexity from all these different blocks. And each one, Brandon was sort of alluding to this, each one of these is farmed separately, picked separately, and then we'll ferment them separately. And then we barrel them down with, keeping each of the block integrity. So when it comes to blending, it makes a more complicated blending, but there's more complexity for the final wine. So, and he mentioned this about single vineyard wines. We don't, our single vineyard wines have at least 3 blocks in any one of them that we ever make, I think. So the idea is not just one block at a vineyard, but multiple sites with multiple clones. And so additional character and complexity.
And that also translates over to the white label wines, like the Santa Rita Chardonnay you guys have, Santa Rita Pinot, which is coming, and then the 7 Syrah. Each of the wines that have the white label on them indicate that they're blends of different vineyards. In some cases, it's, like with the 7 Syrah, it's actually, many, many different vineyards that are intentionally stitched together. Same thing with the Santa Rita Hills Pinot in both the 21 and the 22, you're looking at, 6 or 7 really, really great sites. And for those wines, all of the winemaking is essentially the same. It's blending decisions. So I think that's an important thing to note with our wines is that there's no entry level or, the Santa Rita Hills is farmed fermented and aged to the same level as the single vineyards. It's just a blending decision as to, with the Santa Rita Hills Chardonnay Pinot and the 7 Syrah, we're looking for kind of an open knit texture, something that's going to be really great to drink right away. And again, those wines will also age, but the multiple vineyards and the multiple blocks within that bring a lot of completeness to each of those wines. And I know we're kind of bumping up against time here, and we've been kind of flying, but I should probably quickly touch on Syrah, and then we'll grab some questions, let you guys get on with your evenings. Let's see here. I'll give you just a quick visual to give a bit of a differentiation. So here's Syrah at John Sebastiano Vineyard in Santa Rita Hills. So you can see this is a morning. This is really typical. You can see the fog is starting to kind of roll out from the east back to the west, looking left to right across that. But something we're really influenced by fog and by wind. And again, the photos don't do it justice, because again, this looks like it's almost flat, but this slope is back-breaking when you're picking grapes and moving up and down it. But so Santa Rita Hills obviously was, in the early days, much more known for Pinot Noir and for Chardonnay. But as we were doing way back in the beginning, to give a 30-second synopsis, John and I met working at a wine shop. Our third partner is his brother Steve. Dragonette's their last name. And we decided to learn by doing. So we did a number of apprenticeships. And one of the apprenticeships that I did was with Manfred Krenkel at Senequanon. And at that apprenticeship, my favorite fruit that I worked with at Senequanon came from a vineyard out in Santa Rita Hills called Levin Confessions, which is actually right, can't really see it unless you're really zoomed in, but it's just across the hill there. And so when we had access to plant some Syrah in Santa Rita Hills back in 2007, 2008 at John Sebastiano, we really made a bet on Syrah, and it really just a phenomenal site for it. And at the time, people were thinking, oh, it's too cold for Syrah. But as time's gone on, I mean, it's a real sweet spot. So it's Syrahs that are a little bit more aromatically intense, texturally kind of a little bit more suave and finessed. And then when you move over to Ballard Canyon, this is a great afternoon at Stoltman Vineyard as the sun's starting to set. 10 miles away, so 10 degrees warmer oftentimes at certain times of the day, a little bit different kind of soil, and a viticultural test kitchen. The Stoltman family and Ruben Solorzano, who lived on the vineyard for a number of years, have done about every style of grape growing for their Syrah known to man, from wide space to close space to teepees. And we are fortunate enough now, again, at that vineyard to have, depending on the vintage, 5 or 6 different blocks, including some really close spaced, some older vines that are wider spaced. And they really do remarkably, and even if it's the same clone in certain cases at JSB and at Stoltman, they have beautifully different expressions. And the idea between the 7 and the MJM is just to blend them in ways that complement each other. And I don't know, if John, if you want to touch on anything else, or if we should just grab questions since we're kind of running along.
Yeah, style it. This is a point Brandon was making about the Santa Rita Hills Chard and Santa Rita Hills Pinot, and it applies to that well. Those wines are typically, when we taste all of the barrels, we pick the ones that are the most accessible, right? A little more easygoing. Maybe the tannins are a little bit more, a little bit softer, and the ones that have more tannins or more intensity, or we'll put in something like a single vineyard wine, or in the case of Syrah, the MJM. And that MJM gets a year in barrels, so it's 27 to 30 months, maybe 33 one time, because of the intensity and the tannin structure and everything. You need more time in the barrel to soften that. The 7 is designed for a little more early drinking, but it also can age very well. But it's more just a lighter bodied, lighter style. I think somebody once, a critic, I didn't say this, but they compared the 7 was more like Saint Joseph or Côte-Rôtie versus Hermitage is the MJM, and that's their words, not mine. But that was also nice to read. We certainly enjoyed reading that, but you sort of get the sense of like the body of the different wines, and that's why they're blended the way they are. So we'll wait for
any questions. I know we've been firing fast and furious. So.
Guys, I would assume you all have some questions. Why don't we fire away with questions? Okay, I'll lead us off. Just going back to the days when you were working at the wine shop, I think a lot of times people like to connect with the inspiration behind a winery. So how did you decide to form Dragonette Cellars from starting at a wine shop? And also, I think, are you a musician? Is that right? Do I remember that correctly?
That's what brought me. So we met working at a really great wine shop in Los Angeles, a place called Wally's. It's kind of morphed over the years, but when we were there, it was, one of the iconic shops on the West Coast. They had 8,000 different wines in inventory, which was daunting. I mean, we kind of described it as getting a PhD in wine, working there for a few years just to kind of get to know that inventory, which included everyday wines, but it also had Yquem going back to the 1800s and just these. I mean, it was an incredible place to cut our teeth because dating ourselves a little bit now, but this was 2 decades ago, and it was at a time in the wine trade when you could taste, Grand Cru Burgundies and First Growth Bordeaux and Salon and Krug, and so we were. I'd come to Los Angeles for music, but quickly realized that was not. How should I put this? That music was going to be something that was going to be fun in the background of my life and not the foreground. And wine was something that looked at wine. It was something that just was never ending in terms of its ability to be fascinating and to be inspiring. And my first night on the job, John was the closing manager at the shop. And I should probably turn it over to you, John. You can kind of tap in and tell a little bit about what happened from there. Right?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a lawyer trade, but I always had this problem of needing sabbaticals to stay sane. And one of my sabbaticals turned out to be working at Wally's. And if you knew Wally's, it's sort of legendary for how difficult it is to work there. So I think within about a month, I became the closing manager because everybody above me had left. I'm sort of tongue in cheek, but so yes. So I was working there, and this guy Brandon shows up, and we start talking about wine. He was really fascinated, and I was too. Just we were learning so much stuff, and so when I would do the closing stuff, and Brandon was there, I'd say, oh, "Why don't you go look around in those back in these rooms, this A room and the B room, and find us something to taste?" And so we would buy wine, and we would start tasting, after work or whatever. And we sort of found that we had the same passion for wine, the same interest in wine, the same palates for wine. Part of the reason we don't do Cabernet is, although we love Bordeaux, we sort of were really fascinated by the Rhone and Burgundy more so. Anyway, so we just would be tasting all the time, plus all this education we got at the wine shop. So one day, I think, having tasted all these wines, really, I think what it gave us is a sense of what quality is, more so than a character. Like, it was fun to learn about Burgundy, but you can't make Burgundy in California. But you can go for the quality that a Burgundy wine has, given our the vines that we have here. Anyways, after tasting all these wines, we thought, we should make some wine. So Brandon called a guy at the Vineyards Association who hooked us up with a half a ton of grapes, which we went and picked and then brought back to my house in Hermosa Beach in the garage and made 1 barrel of wine, which was just a fascinating. I mean, we stayed up all night hand distemming this wine, these grapes. Berry. But anyway, that sort of was the inspiration. So having done that, we said, well, that was a lot of fun, but we should really learn how to do this. And rather than go to Davis and spend 3 years learning chemistry, we figured, let's find some great producers and work for them as an apprentice, and sort of, see what this is all about. Do we really want to do this? And, Brandon went down to Australia and went to Torbreck and worked at Equidon. I worked at Fiddlehead Cellars in Lompoc, and then at a place called Coastal Vineyard Care, which was one of the big vineyard managing companies around here. And that was sort of the R&D phase. And my brother was always the behind the scenes businessman, finance, invoicing, computers, all that stuff. So we sort of, after doing this for a couple of years, we just said, we should do this. We can do this. And we're still doing it now. Like, it's been 20 years. I can't believe, but we're still at the winery and we're still doing all the same stuff we did 20 years ago. I think we just both, all three, are doing what we're doing. So.
Very cool. How is do you stay in touch with Kathy at Fiddlehead?
I do. As a matter of fact, I was driving up for just the other day. Yes. Yeah, we bought, so she had the Fiddlesticks Vineyard. And so that was our first, well, I think we got it in 07, 06?
06, yeah.
06 was the first time we got fruit from her, right the year after my apprenticeship. And
Did
so
she sell?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, did she sell the winery?
Right.
She sold the vineyard. Yes. She sold Fiddlesticks.
The vineyard. Okay.
2 years ago to there's an LA investor, of course, with the money. And then a couple of guys, Eric Malia, who's also the farming guy. And I think Justin Willett is involved as well, from Tyler Wines. They bought it. And actually, we've expanded our holdings there since it's been sold. They're great farmers, and it's a great site. And it's
Dimitri and I used to represent Kathy a while back.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Charlie too, actually. Yeah.
So yes, she is an intense personality, as I'm sure you know. But I learned a ton from her, so that was great.
And an icon. I mean,
Blanc,
she's a good teacher. Yeah.
Yeah, she is. She is. Although, did you ever know Karen? Karen Steinwalks, she was her assistant winemaker for years and years. She wasn't there when you guys.
Kathy would come to the market, but I don't think Karen did, and we would just deal with her. So
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Karen's used to say that she loved having me there because Kathy would yell at me and not yell at her anymore. I asked questions like, "Why do you do it that way?" So.
Yeah. The impudence.
Oh yeah.
Who else has a question?
So guys, you do all your own farming at all of the properties?
No, we should clarify that. So we are intimately involved in the farming at all the properties, but it is not our own hands. Now, each vineyard that we work with has their own team. In some cases, it's one of the coastal vineyard care teams. But we are able to have input. So it's interesting. Again, I'll use trying to think of what best examples, like Grissini. So Grissini, we have 3 different blocks in the vineyard. And if you walk through, it'll be fun if you guys ever get a chance to visit during the growing season. We'll go take a look at this sort of thing. But if you walk, the rows are flagged. And so our rows are pruned differently than anybody else in the vineyard. They're shoot thin differently. You just have different goals. And so we're always careful to say that everything is an intended target, right? So it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. But what we're aiming for is, high quality as opposed to higher quantity, which is a lot of folks want a little bit more quantity to be a little more efficient in price. But like at Grissini, so the pruning will happen on certain specific days. We actually prune on the descending moon, so the sap is actually going down in the vines and kind of keeps them a little healthier and a little bit more ability to prevent some of the trunk diseases that happen. We prune pretty tight, so we kind of cut back so there's less wood. We don't do any extra canes, which is a pretty common technique in the more production style vineyards out here. And then throughout the whole season, I mean, our rows of Grissini don't get herbicides, other rows in the vineyard do. So there's that very particular level of differentiation. Contrast that with, say, Radian, where the level of farming at Radian, you have Ruben Solorzano, Coastal Vineyard Care, and the Hilt team. Everything out there is farmed to a really maximal level. So we do have input, but the differentiation from block to block is going to be quite a bit more minimal at Radian than it would be at, say, Grissini or Vogelsang or John Sebastiano. So it depends on each one.
You get
Hopefully
Ruben,
that answered that.
You get Ruben at Stoltman and at the Hilt. And do you source from Honata? I know
Honata does not sell any fruit, actually.
No, really? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Stoltman's pretty stellar stuff.
It really is.
I know Pete well. I love those wines. I sold them for a long time.
Yeah, and that's just one of the things. I mean, a big part of what I think we've done over this now couple of decades is really refining the sources down to what we feel are kind of the best of the best of the best vineyards. And, partnering with people who have a shared vision is super important. I mean, we've definitely lost some good sites along the way, where people just did U-turns. I mean, when we first started, it was interesting. That post sideways boom, the level of quality of farming in Santa Rita Hills was, I mean, really, really, really high. And in the intervening 15 years, the average level of farming has slumped a little bit. Just as things have gotten more competitive and people have tried to kind of mechanize more and, you know, go for lower cost. So we've had to, in a lot of cases, invest into, you know, paying more for a per acre farming contract or just more for a block contract even, in order to ensure that, you know, everything is done by hand in terms of things that touch the canopy or touch fruit. So that's, you know, one thing that when you look at the price points, I mean, I think that, you know, it depends on what you're looking at as your differential, but the reason for differentials in our price are strictly related to the fruit, and the fruit is pretty darn expensive.
Yep. And I was going to ask, whole cluster on Pinot Noir, what you do much of that?
Yes, we do. It depends on the block and depends on the vineyard. We do probably more whole cluster at Fiddlesticks than anywhere else. Those wines tend to have pretty big structure on them, and then, you know, sort of this fruit dominated character. So we like to use the whole cluster both from structural perspective to sort of mix up the tannins a little bit, but also for, you know, sensory, you know, flavors and aromas as well. Radian, like Brandon showed you that cluster. If you did 10% whole cluster at Radian, it'd be like 50% whole cluster. I mean, the cluster there'd just be so many clusters per in the bin. So, and besides that, it has a savory character and an herbal edge to it that doesn't seem like it needs the cluster. You know, the whole clusters wouldn't necessarily benefit that. So yeah, it just depends. I think Fiddlesticks has been up to maybe 25%. Radian would be less than 5. Bedrock would be 10, let's say. So it just depends on which blocks we think would benefit from having the stems included. And of course, the vintage. So there are vintages where when we had heat waves where things started shriveling up and there was a little bit of rot and things where we wouldn't do any whole cluster. So
and we do a little bit of whole cluster on the Syrahs as well. It usually breaks out into bottle at, you know, a pretty small amount, usually under 10%, but it still brings a really interesting kind of aromatic and structural component to it.
Ideally, where do you guys want to see people enjoying your wine? Do you care? Do you prefer it in a retail setting or a restaurant setting, or, you know, your ideal sort of customer base is what? Like, who can we sell your wine to that would make you the happiest?
I got a quick answer for that, actually. Someone who cares. You know,
Okay,
so whether
that's
it's
fair.
Jessica at a retail, whether it's a proprietor at a small restaurant. And what I mean by that is because, you know, we're not people who are interested in press, we've done really well with that in recent years, which has been great. Kind of always been doing the same thing, and the press has kind of picked up on it. But, you know, one of the things that we've found is rather than trying to chase down every Michelin 3-star person who has thousands of people trying to sell 6 bottles at a time to them, you know, just finding ambassadors, you know, people who can get behind the wines and share our story. People like Matthew, actually. I mean, that's that's, you know, from somebody close to home. I don't know if John wants to elaborate on that, but I mean, honestly, you guys know the market so much better than we do, and you know, finding a home where somebody could get excited about the wine and help tell our story to their customer would be most important, rather than on or off or, you know, whatnot.
That's a great answer. That's exactly what. But the whole finding an ambassador, I mean, I think that's the message.
Yeah.
And then real quick, so Jess, she had to jump off, but she was texting me and just kind of screaming how much she enjoyed all the wines she tasted while she was visiting. And if she said, you know, speaking of ambassadors, if she could have it her way, and most of the time she gets her way, she would bring in all of the wines. I know that she recently ordered the 7 and the MJM, I believe.
Right.
But I'm sure things like that will follow. And they, you know, granted, that's the customer. They have 3 locations, 2 sizable retail stores, and a restaurant. And yeah, they definitely praise you guys and your efforts at the winery.
That's great.
Charlie,
Great to hear.
Casey, Mark, anyone else have questions?
Do you guys have any favorites? I know I get questions like that all the time and I never can answer them just because there are so many wines in our portfolio. But do you have any ones that are kind of you're partial to?
Wow. Probably not really is probably the answer to that. Sort of like having multiple children and favoring one over the other. It's interesting. It depends on the customers, right? Like, I think Sauvignon Blanc is a good example. The Sauvignon Blancs, like the Grissini and the Grimms, they've got all the critical acclaim and the press and everything. They're pretty serious wines. And among people who like Sauvignon Blanc, I think that they really like them a lot. Pinot is always so great. Gosh, the Rita's Crown Chardonnay is I just love that wine. But it's really hard to pick a favorite out of any of those.
Yeah, that's the favorite child question. So it's super hard. It's like on a certain day you might have one, but it's, the one thing that I'll mention, I mean, it's pretty cool. You guys, the new PO is great because it has a pretty wide range of diversity. So you'll get to kind of play with pretty good range of the portfolio. I will say we're particularly proud. 2022 was a vintage that was really low yielding in Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, sub 2 tons an acre at Grimm's. And as we were, quick side note, would encourage any of you who haven't been out to please come and visit. And any of your customers or clients or their clients, we're big on the hospitality side in terms of getting people over to the winery and doing education. And so we welcome everyone. But one of the things, we don't do a ton of barrel tasting just because the wines evolve so much and we want to let them do their thing unimpeded. So when we get ready to bottle, we start to taste the wines much more frequently. And I have to say that the 22 Grimms, which you guys are getting a good chunk of, that is a wine that, the low yields combined with that crazy farming they do out there, it's one of the more unique Sauvignon Blancs we've ever made. I mean, it really, really is palate coating. I mean, so for people who are kind of like terroir freaks and into textural wines, that'll be one to look forward to.
Cool. Charlie, did you have something? Okay.
I may I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm newly introduced to you guys, and I understand what you were saying about Matthew being an evangelist. What he said to me when I was telling him that I was going out to Santa Rita was that you guys made the best wine that came from that area, and
That's
close to the
high
best
praise.
wine. The question I have is that it seems from your website, and I looked at your about page and the mission, that you're going with the Burgundy and Rhone. Are you looking at other areas? Are you going to stay within Santa Barbara at bringing in something else to blend with the grapes that you already have?
Good question.
We're gonna stay with Santa Barbara. If you're asking about are we interested in getting grapes from Santa Lucia Highlands or Sonoma, if that's what the question is, that's what I understood you to mean. As an academic exercise, Brandon probably isn't as interested in this as I am. I would love to try that, but I think people's always ask us, what are your plans for the future? And really, it's like to keep doing what we're doing right now, and with pretty much the same sites, and maybe growing a little bit here and there. Maybe there's another, good place to sell, another state or something possibly. But really, I think we have phenomenal sites right now, and the grape quality is amazing. Prices have been climbing, but there's really, I don't think there's much desire to do anything much different than what we're doing right now.
And I'll add on that when we first started, we were actually sourcing Syrah from Santa Barbara and a really pretty incredible vineyard on the far west side of Paso Robles and in Los Alamos in the north part of Santa Barbara County. And what we realized pretty quickly was that with the amount of time we like to spend in the vineyards, from our winery, which is centrally located in Buellton, we could be at any of our vineyards in less than 20 minutes. And that's huge for us. And so we really, over time, we started broader base, and then we moved down to just essentially the San Ynez Valley. And we feel like there's so much beauty and diversity within that there's kind of enough to satisfy curiosity. I will say that, people oftentimes do ask us if we're going to make a Cabernet, because Happy Canyon's been making good strides that way. And if you had asked us that 3 years ago and 5 years ago, you would have get a resounding no, no, no. Where I think now, I wouldn't be too surprised if someday we make a teeny little bit of Cabernet, but it's not something we're actively pursuing. It's just, sometimes like with Grimm Sauvignon Blanc, Rick Grimm came to us and said, "Hey, could you check out my vineyard? You might be interested." And when we saw the way that he was planting it and farming it, we said, "We don't need more Sauvignon Blanc, but we'd love to work with this." It wouldn't be too surprising if that happens on Cabernet or Cabernet Franc or Merlot front at some point. But those grapes have been in Santa Barbara. Syrah was an absolute all-star. Sauvignon Blanc and Happy Canyon established itself pretty early. And outside of Happy Canyon, look what Fred Brander did. It kind of put Sauvignon Blanc on the map from our area. And Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, the Santa Rita Hills really captured our attention. So we basically make what we love and what we love to drink, and then kind of share that elsewhere. So we've learned to never say no, because things pop up. But.
Okay. Thank you.
Charlie, did you have
Along
one?
those lines a little bit, is there anywhere else that you could compare for Sauvignon Blanc in California? I can't think of it. There are some interesting Sauvignons that come from other appellations, but really as a whole, the Happy Canyon, I just think, has really established itself as the place for Sauvignon Blanc. Do you agree?
Which is remarkable, given that
I don't know.
It's 20, just over 20 years old, so it's really young. And to have had that quality that quickly is really pretty phenomenal. Ken Brown, one of the legends around here, he talked about that. He's one of the things that he said. We did a group tasting with him and dinner a couple of years ago, where we tasted side by side each vintage of Radian that we had made. And one of the things that he talked about was, in his experience, he said at certain vineyards that he worked with, it took the vineyard upwards of 20 or 30 years to really define itself and have like a specific personality and terroir. But he said that, for these really great sites, and he was referring to Radian at the time, but, Vogelsang or Grimm's or Grissini could, be spoken about in the same way, that for these really amazing sites, their personality is there from day one or harvest one, which I thought was a pretty interesting insight. And so I think that, we've just been lucky enough to be part of these from a pretty young age, both as our winery and as the vineyards. And I'd add a quick note that, I think one of the questions with Sauvignon Blanc is there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. Because I think that there's just a lot of folks who churn it out as a quick kind of high turnover cash flow kind of a wine. And so I don't know if we know of the different sites within California that could really make top quality potential if they set their minds to it. I would give a quick shout out to like the old vines at Tokawan. Some of those Mondavi Fumé Blancs are really exceptional. And I've had those with 20 years of age that have been stunning. But again, there's a pretty short list. Just people crazy enough to take Sauvignon Blanc that serious, probably.
And would you say that Happy Canyon lends itself to your style of Sauvignon Blanc? Are there, I would compare it. Initially I was like, I can't define this Sauvignon. I can't place it in any other place. The more I taste it, the more I gravitate towards Bordeaux in a stylistic, if you had to go somewhere with it. Are there other styles that other people are doing?
That's an interesting question. So the first part of your question about whether it's Happy Canyon lends itself to our style, I think absolutely. I think I'm not sure we would have. Well, we did get Sauvignon Blanc early on from a few sites that were not in Happy Canyon, but in San Ynez Valley, and we tended to find that these were just a little bit lighter in, they don't have quite that palate intensity that I think the Happy Canyons do, which I think is what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
And so we quickly just said, let's just focus on Grissini and Vogelsang. And then when Grimm's came along, it was such an amazing property. We had to make wine from there. But yeah, definitely that's that more intense style with a much more texture and weight, and the ability to add some oak to it and give it even more structure and longevity. And yeah, we were motivated by the Persangs and the white Bordeaux's of the world, and that's sort of what our style would be. It's what our preference was, and that these grapes seem to fit in that style for sure.
Great.
And it's interesting because even stainless Happy Canyon Sauvignon Blanc, like it's sold out right now, but when it comes back in season, our Happy Canyon white label bottling, a portion of that is typically done in stainless, and it's bottled earlier because we want that to be a little brighter and fresher. And that stainless portion, if you taste that, right before it's bottled, it's had 8 months of aging in a tank, it somehow still has this really broad, a lot of people would be like, oh, that was aged in oak, right? Just because the Happy Canyon kind of mouth coating texture is there even in a stainless version. So yeah, and that's actually a great question that dovetails into the rest of our approach, which our goal, rather than trying to reverse engineer something, we have friends, and again, this isn't a good or bad. I have certain friends of ours who have spent their career trying to reverse engineer Chamble Musigny, where for us, we're in Santa Barbara, we want to make Santa Barbara wine. And we want to make the best damn Santa Rita Hills Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and the most Happy Canyon Sauvignon Blanc. And I think it's part of the fun is to really coax out, what are these sites telling us? And we experiment a bit in the winery to try to figure out, what actually enhances the raw materials that are coming from a given vineyard.
Yeah, I've got customers that are dying for the new release of the Happy Canyon. So we'll look forward to that when that happens.
We're getting beat up on a daily basis. It's not great to have buy the glass programs cut off 4 months early.
I've also had people insist that no, there has to be Semillon in this wine when they taste even the Happy Canyon. There's the textural thing and everything. There's got to be Semillon in here.
We early on we're like, hey, should we work with some Semillon? And once we started to work with fruit from Happy Canyon, we're like, it does not need the Semillon at all.
Yeah.
It inherently has that waxy character that Semillon adds.
Right.
We did plant some next to some of our Sauv Blanc and Vogelsang. But it's like, well, we don't really need that because it's already all in there. But yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, I love them.
Thanks.
I have to go. I'm the host, so I hate to break this up, but let me ask one quick question, and we'll call it an end. By any chance, do you now, or do you anticipate at any point having any library release wines or any Magnum formats that we could share to those ambassadors that have been loyal for a long period of time? And this is something we could actually follow up on in an email if you don't want to answer now.
No, I mean, the short answer is yes, in tiny quantities. I don't know if you add anything to that, John, but we do keep a tiny library and a little bit of large format.
Okay, guys. So if anybody's, been on board for a long time and you want to do them a solid, check in with them before we put in our next PO and we can see if we can get them something special.
Well, guys, thanks for taking so much time in your evenings. And Gray, I did have one last question for you. I shot you an email late on Friday, but when we went to start packing the pallet, I realized I was woefully wrong in my estimate of inventory. Would you be okay with 22 Santa Rita Hills Pinot instead of 21?
I guess just do as much of the 21 as you can and fill the rest with 22 to fill the pallet.
That's awesome. We could do about half and half then, I think, with what we have without having to do shenanigans. So,
well, there's a price difference between 21 and 22?
Not in the Santa Rita Hills Pinot. No, they're the same price.
Oh, the Pinot. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess just send all 22 then. Thank you.
Appreciate it. That helps our logistics.
Yeah, sorry. You did say that it was in different places. I forgot. I'm remembering now. Yeah, just do all 22. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. We're excited about that vintage too. So.
I mean, I'm sure the vintage is going to be good, but it'll be simple. We'll just move on quicker. That's all.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks all your time, and thanks for sharing our.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it.